Today's session is going to be about some of the work we have going on and for our nutrient stewardship programs, resources available, and we should have a good amount of time available for Q&A. So post your questions in the Q&A box, and if not, Peyton and I will just discuss some of the projects that we're working on. I'm going to start out today with kind of an overview of some of our projects and some work that we've been doing recently, and then Peyton's going to talk about some of the programs that we have going on at TFI, and I will, somebody started the recording, so we're good to go. All right, so my name is Sally Flis. I'm the Senior Director of Agronomy at the Fertilizer Institute. We're based in Washington, D.C. And so TFI represents the fertilizer industry in the United States. We work with everything from, our members span the scope of everything from companies that are producing and mining fertilizer to those members that are out on the ground working with farmers and implementing practices and making recommendations in the ag retail side. We also work in research, and one of the things we were able to accomplish in the 2018 Farm Bill was to get the research agenda items included in the 2018 Farm Bill around source rate, timing, and placement of fertilizer. For our nutrient stewardship, for anybody who's not familiar with the program on the call today, is considering the right source rate, timing, and placement of nutrients as we apply them to our crops. It really takes a look at and is applicable to any cropping system. So it really wants us to think about matching crop needs with the products or resources that we have. But it's more than just the nutrient management part. It's more than just source rate, timing, and placement, because in order to make the best for our decisions, we need to understand the site characteristics, the soil characteristics that we're working with, consider the crop yield and quality goals that we have. And when we're talking about products like a corn silage or soybeans, quality isn't as big a factor in what we're thinking when we think about our 4R practices. But when we're looking at some of the more consumer-directed products or specialty crops, quality is influenced by our nutrient management practices, so we need to consider the quality of the product we're producing as well. Other site-specific characteristics to consider are slope, distance to water, other conservation practices, soil temperature. So you'll see in this slide, in the pictures, you've got the sprayer here in the field. You can see some variation across that field, so we want to consider that variation. You can see some slope, you can see some buffer area, all those things we need to consider as we're making our choices. And then in the picture with the two gentlemen, this is a tomato farm in Florida. We need to think about that placement, that the fact that that soil is covered, that you've got a really sandy soil because you're in Florida. So lots of different things to consider as we're making these decisions. Weather is a big one, and unfortunately, we don't have much control over that one. But it's something we want to consider as we're making decisions about when and how much and what type of fertilizer product to apply. The biggest one for the producer and the ag retailer is always cost. So in 2017, I think it was, we did a survey of 200 producers around the US on what do they know about 4R, what are their barriers to adoption, why or why not are they adopting 4R practices. And so both from the producer and the ag retail side, they both stated that their #1 goal is to improve farm operation profit. But they felt that their barriers to making practice changes and to adoption were new equipment needs, labor and time changes, possibly needing new expertise, additional consultants, that kind of thing in order to make those practice changes. And they all mentioned that their agronomist or fertilizer dealer or CCA are their top sources of information on making these decisions. So what we've done is start working on some cost-based case studies to find out what does it cost to change to more advanced 4R practices, And so at 4rfarming.org, you'll find, I think there's 13 case studies posted right now, but there's going to be another 11 getting posted soon. And then we've got a couple more specialty crop ones that'll be joining that group. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about how we came up with those cost study numbers and what we've seen for results. So we worked with our 4R advocates, and Peyton's going to expand and talk a little more on the 4R advocate program during his portion of the presentation today and what those guys really do with us. This was our 2020 group of 4R advocates. And I'm just going to mention here that these guys cover a wide variety, getting back to that idea that 4R really works for any crop management system. We've got sugarcane growers here, sugarcane and sweet corn and some other veg crops. This is a small orchard in Maryland. And a cotton producer in Texas. He actually does organic and conventional cotton, and then some corn, soybean growers in Missouri and Minnesota from this last year. So what we did is work with some of our past 4R advocates to collect 4 years of data at a whole farm average level or for individual fields over 4 years. We, in these little mini budgets, I'll call them, accounted for all costs and equipment that is associated with a fertilizer application. So an example here would be if the farmer is applying a starter fertilizer with seed, we count the cost of that planter and the piece of equipment used to move that planter as a fertilizer application. If they're not applying fertilizer in a starter, as a starter with their seeding, then we don't include that cost in our cost of for our practices. So it's really just very specifically those costs associated with a fertilizer application. We also include the equipment cost, the time, and the fuel use, and these numbers are based on national databases or averages for equipment, used equipment sales available in the areas where the farmers are operating. And then our fertilizer prices that we're using in the software where we're calculating these cost numbers are based on those reported to either us as the Fertilizer Institute or those reported by USDA, and then readjusted as we move around the country. So just to talk about the basic, intermediate, advanced principle. So we've got basic, intermediate, and advanced for our practices spelled out here for corn and soy rotations in the West. And so it's really kind of thinking about what can we do more to control that nitrogen loss, for example, in this table, as we do more advanced nutrient management practices. So you'll see the addition of nitrification inhibitors, using in-season prediction tools, using split applications, accounting for any in-field variability. So really monitoring everything that we're doing. So one of the things we looked at was that transition from basic to advanced practices with these case studies. And the reason we did that specifically around nitrogen is that with some research that we supported with Dr. Tony Vine at Purdue University, we were able to demonstrate that nitrous oxide emission responds to nitrogen management systems, not nitrogen rate application only, and that we can relate that back to the net nitrogen balance. And so for our intermediate farmers that are going from basic to intermediate practices, we can credit them a 7% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. And if they're going from intermediate to advanced, we can credit them another 7%. Or if they go from basic to advanced, we can credit them a 14% reduction in N2O emissions, in addition to any emission reductions that may come from changes in fertilizer application rates in those systems as well. So this is a farm in Illinois, one of the first ones we worked on, and you'll see here he's kind of playing around a little bit with grid versus zone, variable rate sampling and application. So the difference in cost between the grid and zone is really just because he's using 2 different service providers for those different systems. You'll see what his basic to advanced practices are there on the left-hand side of the screen, where he's going from some out-of-season application to all in-season application with up to a 4-way split of his nitrogen application. And what we've found is that as we go from those basic to advanced practices, we're reducing our cost by somewhere between $15 to $24 an acre, depending on which management system on this farm we're looking at. In addition to look at these in a little more detail, this is his yield and some other nitrogen or environmental metrics around this case study. And you'll see his yield is going up over time. We shied away from using yield as a metric too much in these because our budgets focus so specifically on nutrient management practices that there's lots of factors that go into that increased yield number. And so I didn't feel comfortable crediting that full here almost 27 bushel per acre yield advantage just to nutrient management practices. So we see his application rate is coming down as he is applying, as he's gaining that yield, which causes that nitrogen use efficiency to improve and his nitrogen balance to decrease. In the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why we want to keep a close eye on these numbers, because we may be getting a little too efficient and starting to throw the system out of balance and mine some nitrogen and carbon back out of the soil, which is going to decrease our organic matter concentrations. But you'll see at the very bottom there, we can get almost a 35% reduction in his CO2 emission equivalents when we are able to look at advanced 4R practices and all the combination of these practices coming together on this farm. So as I mentioned, just to go a little bit more into why we need to keep an eye on this nitrogen use efficiency number. So here is how nitrogen use efficiency is calculated by the International Nitrogen Expert Panel. And they calculate it a little bit differently. We tend to talk about it from a pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn grain produced. And here they're talking about it more as it's calculated as total nitrogen harvest divided by nitrogen applied. So slightly different calculation of the numbers, why the range on the side is a little bit different here, but the message is still the same. As we get out to that 2017 year and get more and more efficient, we see we're getting into that range where we're potentially risking mining soil nitrogen, which can change our carbon nitrogen balance, can change our organic matter, and as we look to manage for soil health, can impact some of those management factors as well. So just something to keep an eye on as we're looking at some of these metrics and working with producers on increasing efficiency. So we also did case studies for tomatoes in Florida, and you'll see the practice changes he made here. He was having some challenges with the inputs he was getting, and of course the pressures on environmental nutrient loss and concerns around labor in Florida and with a crop like tomatoes led him to seek out some different practices, and they changed how they placed their starter fertilizer, what was in their starter fertilizer. They're using in-season tissue testing, their soil sampling twice a year in order to determine what each crop that's going into those fields really needs. And with these changes, they were able to cut their cost in half between their kind of intermediate and advanced practices, and have a pretty high yield, about 2,100 boxes per acre of tomatoes. Going back to another, so one thing to note on the specialty crop ones, and as you look at the website for the specialty crops as well, we don't have as many of the environmental metrics because there aren't the same sort of, there's not the development of sort of standards and guidelines of how to interpret those environmental metrics. I can calculate things like nitrogen balance and nitrogen use efficiency for a crop like tomatoes, or you'll see on the website, we also have strawberries and a couple potato case studies, but we don't have the same interpretation of those numbers as we have for a crop like corn grain. And so one area that we definitely are looking to learn more about from a group like yourselves, who's in the field working with these guys or has access to some research findings, is what are the correct ranges for numbers like nitrogen use efficiency or nitrogen balance as we look at some of these crops, so that we can show the advantages to these practices, or start to find some of the things like I mentioned in the corn case study, where we could potentially be getting a little more efficient than we really maybe want to be from a soil health aspect. Another quick look at a corn case study. This one is in Ohio, and as he went from his basic to advanced practices, he decreases cost by quite a bit more, by almost $100 an acre. And what he's done is removed any fall nitrogen from his strip till applications. He's looking at some variable rate seeding and starter fertilizer application. He's using some NRCS dollars to test some different nitrogen application for in-season methods and variable rate nitrogen application. So we've got a good variety of these case studies on the website, and the goal is to be able for different people in different regions and for different production systems to kind of find one that they relate to and be able to think about, use them as sort of a guide to think about how they might make some practice changes on their own operations. On the environmental metric side of this farm, even though he's saving more per acre with his practice changes, his emissions reduction isn't quite as good as it was in that first example, and that's driven a little bit by the lower yield, which is based on the environment and the area that this farmer is growing in versus the first one. But we're still able to demonstrate about a 19% reduction in CO2 emissions as we move from these basic to advanced 4R practices. The other item that I looked at in this one is a lot of the environmental, or not environmental, a lot of the sustainability goals out there from different companies are suggesting just rate change as the way to reduce our carbon emissions from crop production. And so in this slide, what I did is compare getting the credit for doing those advanced practices versus if we wanted to achieve that 19% reduction in emissions simply through reducing rate and not making any practice change. And what we find when we get to these advanced years in 2017 is that we'd have to reduce our nitrogen application rate by almost 40 pounds an acre to get that same 19% reduction in CO2 emissions. And that's probably not 145 pounds per acre of nitrogen is probably not sustainable to meet and maintain that 174 bushel per acre yield. So this is why we need to know what the emission advantages are around the 4R practices, because if we have to go about this in a rate reduction manner only, we're probably going to start limiting yield and production. And just one, I think this is my last example of our case studies. This is some seed potato production in Michigan. They switched from doing their in-season applications with a high boy piece of equipment to fertigation, and they were able to save about $30 an acre. They didn't really change their application rates much. They just changed the timing and placement of those applications. And they only had a couple of years to compare here. So you will see some variety in what's posted on the website. And just to point it out one more time, these are available at 4rfarming.org, and we do have quite a variety. And the ones that are coming soon are the ones from Wisconsin, where we've got some examples with some corn silage, some more diverse crop rotations, which are really nice. They do show that you're getting, farmers are crediting for, say, the nitrogen coming out of an alfalfa rotation in that first year corn. And they also include some examples with some manure and nutrients and how those nutrients are being credited for and adjusting application rates. And those should be up soon. One of them's up now. There'll be some more coming. So just one last item on these, we are able to compare across these corn grain systems. So over about just over 13,000 acres and a varying range of yield, we can demonstrate anywhere from a 10 to a 34% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as we go make that progression from basic to intermediate and intermediate to advanced practice implementation, while we're still maintaining or growing yields on these farms. So we're hoping to continue to build this database to be able to communicate this out a little more widely to show the advantages of what farmers are already doing and help promote some of these practices that are good for the farm and good for the soil and can reduce our emissions. NutrientStewardship.org is our other resource area. We're on Twitter and Facebook to give us a follow. And I'm going to pass off to Peyton now to talk a little bit more about our advocate program and some of the other events we've been working on.
Awesome. Thanks, Sally. Good morning, everyone. Peyton Harper. I'm the Senior Manager of Stewardship and Sustainability Programs at the Fertilizer Institute. And where Sally is more on the field level from the agronomic standpoint, I work more alongside her from a programmatic standpoint. So making sure the wheels keep turning and we keep getting where we're trying to get to. You've heard quite a bit about our 4R advocates and how we use them for agronomic purposes, for research, for outreach in the community, for putting together case studies and benefits of 4R practices. But when we boil down the advocate program, I think it's important for all of you who are in the field working with farmers and producers and retailers and all those others that contribute to great agricultural production to actually know what our advocate program is. And our advocate program, plain and simple, is a recognition program for producers and retail advisors who are implementing a strong 4R strategy into operations. So we recognize our 4R advocates as payers, as a farmer and a retailer payer. And each year we select 5 payers from across the United States via a nomination process. There's an online application supporting materials that you're able to submit, and we have a panel of independent judges that goes about selecting our 5 pairs of winners every year. So this year, we're actually celebrating our 10th year of 4R advocates from across the country. So as it stands right now, those nominations are actually due in today as the final day for the 2021 4R advocate program. But a little secret to everyone on the call, if you do have anyone that you think would make an excellent nomination for this, you'll see our emails here at the end. Please feel free to reach out. We would love to have you as an application. So if you have questions or you want to know how to get involved more for next year, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions along with the program. But our advocates over the past 9 years, as we get into our 10th year this year, we have 90 advocates representing over 215,000 privately operated acres from 22 different states in the country. That's a significant amount of land holdings. That's a significant amount of geography that is just covered by these wonderful producers that have some of the most robust 4R strategies that we have ever run across. And most of these guys were already into a 4R strategy. They were already into a nutrient management strategy before they even knew what the 4R brand was. But as Sally's pointed out, as they've grown more into their 4R strategies, they've grown more into the program, and the case studies are really evident of that they have begun to show returns on their 4R investments. So all these practices, these equipment investments, this investment in new technologies, new practices, and honestly, just the time that it takes to put in a great 4R strategy is really starting to pay dividends for these producers in the field. And to us, from the Fertilizer Institute's perspective, from an industry perspective, the key to reaching the farmers with 4R messaging and continue that outreach, continue the growth of the program, and what in all aspects the 4R program is the industry sustainability program. To keep that growth, to keep that momentum moving forward, the gatekeepers are those of you in the field, are those who work directly with the ag retail agronomists, who work directly with the farmers making those recommendations. So it's our goal with the 4R advocates that we're not only creating a program for recognizing great practices, but we're creating a program to help promote that partnership with advisors in the field and farmers actually putting the work to the ground. So our 4R advocates throughout the years have been used in a variety of circumstances to help promote the 4R program and nutrient stewardship, not only via case studies and research efforts, but also public speaking engagements. We use advocates in a variety of different types of webinars, such as the one we're on today. Back when we were all meeting in person, a variety of different meetings, which we really and truly hope to get back to that in the near future. Having advocates able to meet in person, being able to communicate with their neighbors, because we all know a couple of different things about farmers, but 2 of the things we know that the 2 people that are most likely to listen to, their banker and other farmers. And through our advocate program, we're able to have that one-on-one communication with farmers, talking about the different practices that they see work for them, having that local advocacy, which truly makes all the difference in our industry. Whenever we continue to look at the advocate program and kind of how it evolves for us, we talk about all the different programs and aspects and the ways that we're able to use them for outreach. And if Sally, if you'll hit the next slide for me, we'll get to how we're actually able to use them for events and strategies that take place across the country. One of these key events that we do and work on are our 4R field days. So the 4R field days are exactly what they sound like. They are field days centered around 4R implementation practices. And our advocates have played a critical role in these events and these field days. So actually several of the ones, and you'll see a map, you see a map here on the screen showing all the different locations that we have had field days in. All of the light green states with the stars in them have been hosting field days for at least 2 years. A few of them have been hosting since 2016. Going into this year was going to be expanded into the dark green territories that you see there as well. But unfortunately, due to the COVID circumstances, we've had to back away from those in-person meetings. But a variety of these states have worked on independent 4R virtual field days. And as a planning committee, which I should recognize our planning committee for this as the Fertilizer Institute, keeping kind of the collaborating body there, the Mosaic Company, and Environmental Tillage Systems come together and work with local state hosts to host these events across the country. So we're working direct with farm bureaus, with agribusiness entities, with different types of retail organizations, working direct with agricultural and fertilizer state associations in these various geographies to be the on-ground host for these events. Really trying to reach into that local dynamic, make sure that we're able to have as much of a local feel and presence, because as you were able to see through some of Sally's comments, through the case studies, they say all politics are local. Well, 4Rs are even more local than politics in this sense. One field is never the same from the one that's just sitting across the road from it. And with our field days, we truly try and recognize this and recognize those local practices that fit into a robust 4R strategy. So coming early this spring, we'll be having a national virtual event with our 4R field days that will be able to showcase not just practices from what would work across the nation, what is naturally good nutrient management practices, but specific examples from our host geographies and host organizations. So we'll have a pretty robust picture there that we'll be able to share with folks. So please keep an eye out for that, as it'll be coming this upcoming spring. Getting more into looking at events. Our 4R advocates have really played a strong role in speaking engagement for us over the past several years. And as the 4R message and 4R footprint has begun to grow, the Fertilizer Institute has taken a greater engagement in in-person conferences and events to be able to bring a greater amount of resources to our audience. And one of those was the acquisition of the InfoAg conference, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's been happening for several years, kind of in a central Corn Belt location for the past few in St. Louis. Well, the InfoAg conference is now owned by the Fertilizer Institute. And as we have taken over the conference, we were looking at how we can better integrate 4R messaging and 4R principles into the materials presented there. InfoAg is an excellent convening resource because it really brings together the premier folks in precision ag, making sure that those new technology services and emerging organizations have a location and a platform to reach an on-the-ground audience. What better place to talk about advocacy, to talk about some of our 4R practices and principles than at a conference bringing together those wonderful folks. So for us, InfoAg was a very natural fit. Again, because of this year, InfoAg is now going to be completely virtual, airing December 15th through 17th online, and you can learn more about that at infoag.org. Registrations have been reduced for this year for the virtual event to make it more accessible for a variety of folks in the field. But leading up to InfoAg, we have been hosting a series of webinars called the InfoAg Learning Exchange. Learning Exchange is a webinar series focused specifically on precision ag, focused on gearing you up for those messages, new technologies, organizations that you're going to see at InfoAg virtually in December. And as we've been gearing up for that with the Learning Exchange, we have had 4R advocates speak on there. We have had industry professionals that have been presenting on those. The Learning Exchange has just really been an excellent way for us to continue outreach and messaging around not just case studies and agronomic research, but also some of those emerging technologies that are allowing 4Rs to continue a real steady growth and progression into the field. So what I would like to leave you with today is we're going to get more into question and answers here in a second, is when we look at the 4Rs and we look at the different ways that we're using some of our core programs, so the advocate program, for example, we're constantly looking for new footprints, new opportunities, InfoAg conference being one of those that we're able to continue outreach and messaging within a 4R strategy and 4R principles to an audience. So my encouragement to you is take a look at InfoAg coming up this December, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have today on the Q&A regarding that conference, and also the 4R practices and strategies in general. So with that, Sally, we'll get it kicked back off and start off with some question and answer.
Sounds good, Peyton. I'm just going to go back to our resource slide here so you guys can take down any of this websites or whatnot you might have missed earlier. First, I had a quick question for you, Peyton. If anybody who's on the call or listens to the recording is interested in having one of our advocates speak and notices they have a local one, kind of what do they need to do to get in contact with those advocates and see if they can get them involved in their program?
Absolutely. So if you know that advocate directly, please feel free to reach out. They get personal invitations for stuff all the time. But if you're looking for one that is to fill a specific slot, or you're looking for someone to speak on a specific topic and think an advocate would be a good fit for it, please reach out to myself or Sally directly, and we'll be able to make those connections for you. So it's something that our advocates have become rather used to. A lot of them really get a kick out of speaking in front of people, and let me tell you, they're an interesting group to listen to their perspectives from.
Great. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A here that I will go through, and if you guys have more, keep putting them in there. So the first one from Matt is about how we incorporated the equipment into the case study. So that is based on just a cost per acre, and we take the cost per acre of operating that piece of equipment, both the fixed and the variable cost, into account every year. So we're leaning more towards an annual use of that, and not really that they purchase the equipment all in one year. It's on a per acre basis for what a fixed or variable rate cost would be to operate that equipment. Peyton, who would be a local contact for somebody for the Fertilizer Institute?
Well, as Sally mentioned at the beginning, we are a national trade association, so we do cover the entire breadth of the U.S. So a local contact for the Fertilizer Institute would be, we do have contacts and partners that we work with on a local level. State agribusiness associations are always a good contact for that. I would also say that if you have a specific question or quandary, please feel free to reach out to us directly as well from a national level, and we'll be able to find and work with who would be the best local partner for you to reach out to. Also on nutrientstewardship.org, we do have a program called our 4R Partner Program, which are local organizations that are dedicated to, not dedicated, but they are not solely dedicated. They all have different business entities, of course, but they have signed up and are willing to help promote 4Rs within their area and their spheres of influence. So I would highly encourage you to take a look at that listing as well at nutrientstewardship.org under 4R Partners to find someone who may be operating in your local area.
Thanks, Peyton. Steve, you also asked about what have we done with alfalfa. So in the case studies in Wisconsin there is a lot more alfalfa going on in those. So there will be some alfalfa in there. We're also always looking for new partners to coordinate with on expanding our case study reach. So if any of you are working with farms that you think would be a good recommendation for a new case study, then feel free again to reach out to us, and Peyton and I will both put our emails in the chat before we're done here, so you guys know how to get in touch with us easily for stuff like maybe creating a new case study. Another question I had for you, Peyton, would be what other resources besides the meeting on the slide I've got up still? I've got stuff like the pocket guide and the 4-hour plant nutrition manual. How would people go about getting those sort of resources, and how does that work for different meetings?
Yeah, so we do make a variety of resources available for free online through the website, but we also do have printed materials that are available, the 4-hour pocket guide being one of those that we do make available for free to 4-hour supporters. So if you do have an opportunity coming up and you would like some handout materials or some type of physical pieces to use, yes, please feel free to contact us directly. We can get those sent out to you. But I also saw a question in here, Sally. Somebody's asking who is the representative in Florida, and is that David Royal? So for anyone who knows David, David he works for the Nature Conservancy, but is one of those local partners who really helps promote the 4-hour messaging and engagement. Does an excellent job, and there's probably several of you on the call who do the same. But yes, if you also know someone in your local area who is strong in 4-hour supporting and 4-hour outreach, they too should have several of these handouts and printed copies of things that would be available for meetings or outreach that you could ask for. So we have a variety of ways to get them, but please never hesitate to reach out to us as well. One other thing that I should mention as a resource that we don't necessarily have listed here, we do have a 4-hour newsletter that comes out quarterly, providing updates for what's happening around the country, sometimes what's happening in very local areas, updates on the 4-hour field days, upcoming events, and honestly, just some interesting read pieces that will be in there, including some of the research pieces that Sally so greatly puts together. But that is available as well at nutrientstewardship.org, and there's a field right there on the homepage that you can sign up, and you'll start receiving the 4-hour quarterly newsletter with the next round. Conveniently enough, that next round of the newsletter will be coming out here within the next 2 weeks. So be on the lookout for that for those of you that are already signed up for it. But for those of you who have not yet, there's still plenty of time to get on that email outreach list. So please feel free to do that, and I would actually highly encourage it. Sally, we were talking about the case studies a second ago, and you've talked a lot about where we've gone with them so far, but what are some of the plans for expansion into the future? Where are we looking to do that? And for those who have specific ideas on that, what's the best way for them to get involved in them?
Yeah, so we're currently working with some sugar beet growers through the American Sugar Beet Grower Association. We're going to have some case studies coming from Montana, Nebraska, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, working with those growers. That was the Sugar Beet Growers Association reached out to us directly. We've worked with the local Farm Bureau, so Ohio Farm Bureau helped us get some contacts and some case studies together. A lot of them have been the advocates, but we'd be glad to work on other crops and other areas. I see we've got a question here about tropical crops as well. We don't go outside the US as the Fertilizer Institute. We really just work in the US. We do have some resources we could direct you to for tropical crops, but we've got a few case studies in Florida that's been working with our partner, David Royal down there, helping us get in contact with those different farms. But really just if you have farms you'd like to showcase or crops that you think we need to work on, and you've got some examples that you can help us get the data. We're also working with Washington State University to do 6 case studies on some different crop variety that they have out there versus the upper Midwest. Just reach out to myself and we can see how we can put something together for that to build some more data and variety into what we've got available on 4hourfarming.org. I've got Steve's got a question here. Alfalfa tissue testing. I haven't worked a lot with alfalfa tissue testing recently. And in the case studies, it'd really just be something that we would highlight, that we would account for that cost if it's something that they're using in order to make a nutrient application decision. Steve, you also asked us about grants available to do research. We do have the 4R Research Fund. I forgot to include a slide here, but the 4R Research Fund is dollars, almost just over $11 million that TFI members have contributed above and beyond their membership dues in order to help us fund research. So we've currently funded about 15 projects across the US, and some of the new ones are getting out of that Corn Belt area. So we've got cherries, alfalfa, and some other specialty crops on a project down in Utah, in Arizona. We've got some specialty crops. We've got almonds in California in this round of research. And that information is available on 4rresearch.org, the different projects that we've funded. There will likely be another RFP coming out from the research fund sometime in the next 6 to 9 months, looking to fund some additional projects, but currently we don't have any open calls for proposals or open funding out there. The other thing that we are interested in around grants is we are happy to help with either letters of support around 4R research projects, or how we could be involved as having things like more case studies done as part of research projects or programs that you guys are developing. So again, reach out to Peyton or myself if you're developing some proposals where you think partnering with TFI on that proposal would be a good fit. The last question we have in here right now is from Iris. You asked about the % reduction on a slide, and I didn't catch when you posted that. So if you could let me know maybe which case study you were talking about there, we can go back to that, that slide.
And Sally, another question I think the audience would find rather interesting is, as we communicate and talk to farmers around, not necessarily the case studies, but we're reaching out into specialty crops, getting outside of, corn and soy in the Midwest. When we expand into that, no matter where you are and what you're talking to farmers about in relation to the 4Rs, what would be your one message that you would have folks take to the farmer? What would be that one thing that you would hope farmers are left with when we talk about the 4Rs?
That they work for anybody, and that it's really, and maybe it's because I work with 4R all the time, but I feel like 4R is really the base of so many things we're talking about. We really need to consider source rate, timing, and placement, whether we're talking about managing our soils for improved soil health, whether we're talking about regenerative ag, whether we're talking about all these different buzzwords you hear out there about how we should be managing our nutrients or managing our farms. Making the right source rate, timing, and placement decisions for any nutrient application, whether it's a fertilizer or manure application, is really kind of where that starts. And it gets back to those pieces that I mentioned at the beginning that we need to consider when we make those. We really need to have that good site-specific understanding. What's the soil like there? What's the farmer's goals? What is it going to cost them? What's the weather like? How do all of these things impact us making the right decision? We can't go out and just add a conservation practice or add another practice without making the changes on the application or management of nutrients in order for those to be effective and productive in those systems. So 4Rs work for everybody, but 4Rs are more than just thinking about source rate, timing, and placement. I guess we kind of be two things instead of just one.
And for those of you looking to take another dive a little bit deeper into that and looking at all those different aspects of 4R, I would highly encourage you to take a really, really hard look at the Info Ag Conference coming up in December, because all of those technologies, all of those new services, new products, we're really going to have including meteorology, talking a little bit about weather. we're really going to be taking a deeper dive into 4R management from across the country and all those resources that are out there to help farmers, to help advisors such as yourselves really get that message to the farmer. So please take a deeper look at InfoAg, and I'd be happy to answer any individual questions that y'all may have on it as well.
Yeah, and so I've got a question here on topics and speakers to participate in virtual conferences. So any of the TFI staff is always available to help participate in conferences. Myself, Peyton, we have 2 other 4R staff members that would be able to talk about 4R stuff or the research fund. We also have policy staff. So if you're looking for somebody to give an update on what's going on in DC policy and how that might relate to what's going on locally, they're available. We've got a couple, an individual who specializes in transportation and policy and challenges for the fertilizer industry. And then markets and economics, we also have some staff that would be available to cover those types of topics as well. Through our research fund projects, we do have great connections to the researchers that could be available to talk about their specific projects. So the easiest way to take a look at that would be to take a look at the 4rresearch.org website and see the different projects and the different researchers associated with those. And if you need help contacting those different individuals, we can certainly help you guys make contact to have those individuals talk about their projects. And then Iris, your question on percent reduction. So some of these farms are reducing nitrogen use, but the percent reduction is related to the calculation of the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions related to nitrous oxide emissions. So we're not, some of them getting to that carbon emission reduction. I'm just going to go back to one of those slides. So you'll see here that yes, he did reduce his nitrogen application rate per acre, and that is a piece of calculating this CO2 emissions per bushel. But we're also able to credit that 14% reduction in emissions because he's doing more advanced nutrient management practices for our practices on the farm. So this percent reduction in CO2 emissions, and I apologize, that isn't labeled very well. The hazard of talking about it all the time. And knowing what I'm talking about, but maybe not communicating it well to the audience. So this percent reduction is really just around the CO2 emissions per bushel. And so it represents both a reduction in fertilizer application, but also that reduction that we can give credit for doing those advanced 4R practices. Peyton, any closing thoughts on resources or asks for the audience before we finish up here?
No, the one thing that I would love to leave everyone with today is just knowing that we do have a variety of 4R resources out there. If you're looking to have a 4R conversation with someone, please take a look at our resources. Please take a look at what's available for learning opportunities out there. The more conversations we have regarding nutrient stewardship and 4R practices and strategies, the better off we're going to be as an agricultural industry. The better off we're going to be from a policy standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, to just a overall life on the farm standpoint. I really think that focusing in on 4Rs and nutrient management is a key to a happy and healthy American agricultural future. And I welcome any questions or any follow-up from anyone on that as well, and we'll be happy to help get you pointed in the right direction.
All right. One last question in our chat. Are we looking at groundwater quality? Right now, we haven't picked the best tool yet to look at groundwater quality around the case studies. We're looking at a couple of the different USDA tools where hopefully we'll be able to calculate some more of those, both ground and surface water quality advantages to implementing 4R practices. We focused on that nitrogen emission number, one, because it's kind of a hot topic to talk about emissions from farms. And so we want to show how we can impact that with 4R practices, but also because we have a good tool to be able to calculate that right now. Some of the research projects, I think all of our 4R Research Fund projects are measuring both surface and groundwater quality and changes in nutrient loading as they implement different 4R practices in the project. So that would be the best resource to direct you to right now is, again, that 4rresearch.org website and some of the research summaries or current projects in process where they are measuring groundwater quality. But if anybody's got suggestions on tools or ways for us to look at that water quality piece with case studies, I'd be glad to learn more about those as well. On the rainfall aspects in research projects, so all of the different research sites are recording weather aspects for those individual sites. So it's part of something we look for in those proposals that they are collecting weather data. And the other thing I believe we've got in all the projects that are actual in-field projects is they all are doing year-round collection as well. So there's year-round weather and year-round surface tile drainage or groundwater monitoring, or nutrient loss monitoring, and emissions monitoring. So that a lot of times past research, we only had data on during the growing season, what's happening. So we've kind of pushed our projects to do that year-round collection so that we can get a better idea of when are these losses happening to help us manage in some of these hotspot watersheds. All right, well, thank you guys for coming today. I'm glad we were able to get such a good group. The recording, we've got to figure out exactly where we're going to make the recording available, but we did record today, so we will be able to get this out to you and to those who weren't able to attend today. So feel free to reach out to Peyton or myself with any questions, follow up after this, and we appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you.